Think about the last argument you won, not a debate you participated in, not a discussion where both sides walked away having learned something. A real argument, one where the stakes felt personal, where something important was on the line, where you pushed back hard, enough and long enough that the other person finally conceded the point. Now think carefully about what actually changed afterward. Did the person who conceded truly change their mind? Did they walk away from that conversation with a new belief, a new respect for your position, a genuine shift in how they saw the situation? Or did they concede the words while quietly, privately holding on to everything they believed before? Now, with the added weight of having been made to feel wrong in front of someone else, because that is what argument almost always produces. Not conversion, not persuasion in any deep or lasting sense. It produces the appearance of resolution layered over the reality of resentment. And resentment in the world of power is a debt that eventually gets collected. This is the foundation of Robert Greene's 9th law, and it is one of the most practically useful principles in the entire book. Greene's argument is precise, and once you see it, impossible to unsee. Words are the weakest form of proof. They can be doubted, reinterpreted, dismissed, or simply forgotten. They exist in the air for a moment, and then they are gone, leaving behind only whatever emotional residue the exchange produced. And that residue, especially in a heated argument, especially when ego is involved, is rarely positive. Actions, by contrast, create facts. They produce outcomes that exist in the world independent of anyone's interpretation. They demonstrate rather than declare, and demonstration, Greene argues, is a form of communication so much more powerful than declaration that the two are barely comparable. He draws one of his most elegant illustrations from the Italian Renaissance, specifically from the life of Michelangelo, who was commissioned by Pope Julius II to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo was a sculptor. He had little interest in painting, and even less patience for the political maneuvering of the papal court. But rather than argue about his qualifications, rather than debate the merits of the commission or defend his vision against the skepticism of those around him, he simply worked. For 4 years, largely alone, lying on scaffolding, he painted, and when the ceiling was unveiled in 1512, there was nothing left to argue about. The work spoke with a completeness and an authority that no amount of prior persuasion could have approached. Every doubt was answered. Every critic was silenced, not by words, but by the overwhelming, undeniable reality of what had been created. This is the highest expression of Law 9, argument abandoned entirely in favor of demonstration so complete that argument becomes unnecessary. But Greene also addresses the more common, more immediate version of this principle, the everyday moments where the temptation to argue is strongest and the cost of yielding to that temptation is highest. In professional environments and relationships of power, and situations where your competence or your judgment is being questioned, the instinct to defend yourself verbally is almost overwhelming. It feels wrong to stay silent when someone is mischaracterizing your work or dismissing your ability. It feels like acceptance, like weakness, like allowing an injustice to stand unchallenged. But Greene asks you to look at what verbal defense actually produces in those moments. When you argue for your own competence, you are asking the other person to simply take your word for it. You are placing the resolution of the question entirely in their hands, and their willingness to believe you, to update their opinion, to be moved by your self-assessment. And most people in most situations are not moved that way. Their initial impression, once formed, acts as a filter through which your words pass with diminishing effect. The far more powerful response is to let the next action answer the question, to demonstrate, through what you do rather than what you say, that the doubt was unfounded. This takes patience. It takes the discipline to absorb the discomfort of being misjudged without immediately reaching for the relief of self-justification. But the conviction it eventually produces in the other person is of an entirely different quality than anything argument could have generated. There is a political dimension to this law that Greene explores with particular care, because in the world of power, being seen to argue, especially with someone above you, or in a public setting, carries its own costs entirely separate from whether you win or lose. The person who argues frequently signals something about their relationship with authority. They signal that they are difficult to manage, that they resist rather than execute, that their need to be right in the conversation supersedes their commitment to the outcome. And in environments where power is being allocated, that signal is read and remembered. The person who says little absorbs the direction and then delivers results that exceed what was asked. That person communicates something entirely different. They communicate that they are safe to invest in, that the power placed in them will be well used. And that is a message that no argument, however brilliantly constructed, could ever deliver as effectively. This law does not ask you to be passive. It does not ask you to accept injustice without response or to swallow every mischaracterization without consequence. It asks you to choose your instrument of response more carefully. When something needs to be answered, answer it with what you do. When a doubt exists about your capability, remove it with your output. When a disagreement cannot be resolved in conversation, let the results of your decision speak in the language that power actually understands. Words fade. Arguments dissolve. The emotional residue of a debate lingers long after the specific content has been forgotten. But what you build, what you create, what you deliver into the world as a concrete and undeniable fact, that remains, that accumulates, that compounds over time into a record so clear and so consistent that the question of your ability stops being a question anyone feels the need to raise. Let your work be your argument. Let your results be your rebuttal. And let the quality of what you do speak in the only language that power has ever truly respected. Because the person who demonstrates never needs to defend, and the person who delivers never needs to convince. There is a person most of us have known at some point in our lives. They are not malicious. They are not cruel. They do not set out to cause harm to anyone around them. But somehow, consistently, things go wrong in their vicinity. Projects they are involved in stall or collapse. Relationships around them develop tension and fracture. Opportunities that seem solid begin to erode the moment they enter the picture. And the people who spend significant time in their orbit find themselves, slowly and almost imperceptibly, pulled into the same gravitational field of difficulty, frustration, and stagnation. You may have felt it yourself. That particular exhaustion that comes not from your own problems, but from the prolonged proximity to someone else's. that slow drain of energy, optimism, and forward momentum that has no single identifiable cause, only the quiet, accumulated weight of being near someone for whom things consistently, reliably do not work out. Robert Greene names this phenomenon with a word that is deliberately clinical and deliberately unsettling. Infection. This is one of the laws that makes people most uncomfortable, because it asks something of us that runs against some of our deepest social instincts. We are taught to be loyal, to stand by the people we care about, to believe that compassion means staying close to those who are struggling, and that abandonment is a moral failure. These are not wrong values. In the right context, they are among the finest expressions of human character. But Greene is not talking about struggle. He is not talking about the temporary difficulty of someone going through a hard season who has the internal resources to come through it. He is making a more specific and more uncomfortable distinction. He is talking about a particular kind of person, one whose unhappiness is not situational but structural, not a response to circumstances but a way of being in the world, a chronic, self-renewing orientation toward misfortune that does not lift, does not improve, and does not respond to outside help in any lasting way. And he is arguing that this orientation is not merely a personal quality. It is contagious. The mechanism Greene describes is not mystical. It is psychological and behavioral, and it operates through several distinct channels simultaneously. The first is emotional. Human beings are profoundly social creatures, wired at a neurological level to attune to the emotional states of those around them. When we spend sustained time near someone in a state of chronic negativity, anxiety, or despair, our own emotional baseline begins to shift toward theirs. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually in the small daily calibrations of mood and outlook, we absorb more of their frequency than we realize. What felt like optimism becomes tempered. What felt like confidence begins to carry a new undertone of doubt. We attribute these shifts to our own circumstances, never quite tracing them back to the source. The second channel is reputational. Association is one of the most powerful forces in the social world. Who you are seen with communicates something about who you are, and consistent proximity to someone whose life is characterized by failure, conflict, or instability attaches those qualities to your name in the minds of observers. Fairly or not, the people who make decisions about your future notice not just your individual qualities, but the ecosystem you have chosen to inhabit. The third channel is practical. People in chronic distress are, by necessity, drawing resources from their environment. Time, energy, emotional bandwidth, sometimes financial support. These are resources that, in their absence from your own life, are simply not available for the work of building what you are trying to build. Greene reaches into ancient history for one of his most striking illustrations. The story of Lola Montez, a 19th century dancer and courtesan whose company was associated so consistently with the downfall of the powerful men who became attached to her that she became almost legendary in her era as a figure of ruinous influence. King Ludwig I of Bavaria, one of the most stable and respected monarchs of his time, became so consumed by his association with her that his judgment deteriorated visibly. His political standing collapsed, and he eventually abdicated his throne. Greene's point is not that Montez was a villain. It is that the emotional and social field she generated was one that the people nearest to her could not inhabit without cost, and the king, who had everything to lose, paid the full price of ignoring that reality. There is a counterintuitive dimension to this law that deserves careful attention, because Greene also points out that the opposite principle holds with equal force. Just as misfortune and negativity are contagious, so are energy, confidence, and momentum. The people who radiate genuine optimism, not naive positivity, but the deep, grounded confidence of someone who has navigated difficulty and maintained their forward orientation, elevate the people around them in ways that are just as real and just as measurable as the drain produced by their opposite. This means that the application of Law 10 is not simply about avoidance. It is about active curation, about understanding that the emotional and social environment you inhabit is not a passive backdrop to your life. It is a force that shapes your trajectory as surely as any decision you consciously make, and that choosing that environment with the same deliberateness you bring to your professional decisions is not coldness, it is strategy. But this law will make you uncomfortable if you let it, because there are people in your life right now, people you care about, people you feel responsible for, people whose pain is real and deserves compassion, who may fit the pattern Greene is describing. And the idea of creating distance from them sits in conflict with values you hold genuinely. Greene does not ask you to be heartless. He asks you to be honest, to recognize the difference between helping someone and being pulled under with them, to understand that your own stability, your own momentum, your own continued ability to build something meaningful is not a selfish concern. It is a precondition for any positive impact you hope to have on the world around you. You cannot pour from an empty vessel, and you cannot maintain your trajectory if the environment you have chosen is consistently, quietly working against it. Choose your proximity with care. Protect your energy the way you protect your reputation and your time. And understand that the people you allow closest to you are not just companions on the journey. They are in ways both visible and invisible, co-authors of where that journey leads. There is a mistake that talented people make more consistently than almost any other. They work hard to become excellent. They develop a skill, a capability, a depth of knowledge that sets them apart from the people around them. They invest years, sometimes decades, into becoming genuinely good at something. And then, having achieved that excellence, they make an assumption that feels entirely reasonable, but is, in the architecture of power, profoundly dangerous. They assume that excellence is enough. They assume that being the best at what they do will naturally translate into security, into indispensability, into a position so firmly established that no one would dare remove them from it, that the quality of their work is, by itself, a sufficient guarantee of their continued relevance. And then one day, without warning, they discover that it is not. Robert Greene's 11th law addresses one of the most important and least discussed distinctions in the entire study of power, the difference between being valuable and being indispensable, between being someone that an organization or a person appreciates and being someone they genuinely cannot function without. These are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where careers end, where influence evaporates, and where people who believed their position was secure discover too late that security was never something their excellence alone could guarantee. Greene's argument begins with a simple observation. Value can always be replaced. Skills can be learned by others, outsourced to new talent, or made obsolete by changing circumstances. The person who is valuable but replaceable occupies a position that is, at its core, temporary, dependent on the continued willingness of those above them to keep making the same choice when alternatives exist. Indispensability is different. It is not about being the best. It is about being the only, about having constructed a relationship, a role, or a position in such a way that removing you creates a problem that cannot easily be solved, that the cost of your absence exceeds, by a significant margin, any benefit that might come from replacing you. Greene reaches back to one of the most instructive examples in Renaissance history. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing about the relationship between rulers and their advisors, observed a pattern that repeated itself across courts and across centuries. The advisor who made themselves indispensable, not simply through competence, but through the careful, deliberate construction of a relationship in which their specific knowledge, their specific access, their specific understanding of the ruler's mind became something the ruler could not replicate elsewhere. These advisors did not just serve. They positioned themselves as the keeper of something irreplaceable, whether it was access to a specific network, a unique understanding of a complex situation, or simply the accumulated trust of years of intimate counsel. They built into the relationship a dependency that protected them far more effectively than any formal title or public reputation ever could. But Greene's most vivid illustration comes from the world of art. Michelangelo, who appears again in this book as a figure who understood power as well as he understood marble, was masterful at managing his own indispensability. He took on commissions of such extraordinary ambition, projects of such singular complexity, that the idea of replacing him mid-execution became genuinely unthinkable, not because no other sculptor existed, but because no other sculptor could step into the specific vision, the specific relationship with the patron, the specific architectural and artistic logic of what was already underway. He made himself, in the most practical sense, impossible to remove. There is a psychological dimension to this law that Greene explores with particular precision, because dependency is not just practical, it is emotional. And emotional dependency, when it exists, is often more powerful and more durable than any structural arrangement. The person who understands what someone needs, not just professionally, but in terms of their deeper desires for recognition, for reassurance, for the feeling of being understood, and who positions themselves as the consistent, reliable source of that thing, has created a bond that operates beneath the level of rational calculation. This is why certain advisors outlast the fall of the leaders. They served and find themselves welcomed by whoever comes next. Why certain individuals remain at the center of power through transitions that eliminate everyone around them. They have not just made themselves useful. They have made themselves necessary in ways that their replacements, however talented, cannot immediately reproduce. Now here is the dimension of this law that requires the most honest self-examination, because the principle of manufactured dependency can be applied with integrity or without it. And Greene, characteristically, describes both possibilities without flinching from either. The version without integrity involves deliberate withholding, keeping others in the dark, hoarding information or access, creating artificial scarcity where none naturally exists. This approach works sometimes for extended periods, but it is inherently fragile. It depends on the continued ignorance of those around you, and the moment that ignorance lifts, the position collapses. The version with integrity is more sophisticated and more durable. It involves genuinely developing capabilities, relationships, and forms of knowledge that are authentically difficult to replace. Investing so deeply in a specific domain that your understanding of it exceeds what any reasonable alternative could quickly match. Building trust over time with such consistency that the emotional and relational cost of losing you is real, not manufactured. This version creates dependency as a natural byproduct of genuine excellence combined with strategic self-positioning. And it is, Greene argues, the only version that produces security lasting enough to be worth building. The world will always have talented people. In almost every field, in almost every organization, in almost every context where power is being exercised, there are capable individuals who could, technically, fill the role you occupy. Capability alone has never been a guarantee of security. What creates genuine, lasting security is the construction of a position so specific, so deeply embedded in the particular needs of a particular person or institution, that the thought of losing you produces not just inconvenience, but genuine concern. Do not simply be the best at what you do. Be the only one who does what you do, in the way that you do it, for the specific people who have come to depend on it, because excellence gets you in the room. But indispensability is what keeps you there, and in the long, patient game of power, the person who cannot be easily replaced is the person who never has to worry about being removed. There is a moment in almost every significant relationship, professional, personal, or political, where trust is either established or withheld. It rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with ceremony or clarity. It is usually a small moment, a conversation that could have gone either way, a gesture that was either made or not made, a single act of openness, of generosity, of apparent vulnerability, that landed at exactly the right time and shifted something in the other person. Something that once shifted became the foundation of everything that followed. You have experienced this. The person who, in an early interaction, told you something they did not have to tell you. Who gave you something before you had given them anything? Who extended a trust that felt in that moment like a gift and made you want, instinctively and immediately, to be worthy of it. What you experienced in that moment was not accident. It was not simply the natural warmth of a generous personality. It was whether the other person knew it, consciously or not. One of the most elegant and most effective moves in the entire architecture of power. Robert Greene calls it selective honesty. And it is, in many ways, the most human law in this entire book. The principle operates on a truth so fundamental to human psychology that it transcends culture, era, and context. We are disarmed by honesty, by genuine generosity, by the experience of receiving something, a truth, a kindness, an act of apparent selflessness that we did not expect and did not ask for. When someone gives us something freely, something in us responds, a reciprocity reflex that is wired into the deepest, layers of social behavior activates without our permission. We feel, whether we acknowledge it or not, a pull toward that person, a softening of whatever guardedness we arrived with, a desire to match what we have been given with something of our own. And in that moment of softening, in that brief window where defenses are lowered and goodwill is high, the person who created the moment holds a quality of access to us that no amount of strategy or pressure could have manufactured. Greene is not describing manipulation in the crude sense of the word. He is describing the strategic understanding of how trust actually forms between people, and how that understanding, applied with precision and patience, becomes one of the most powerful tools in the game of power. He reaches into the history of diplomacy for one of his most instructive illustrations. Count Metternich, the 19th century Austrian statesman who shaped European politics for nearly 4 decades, was a master of this principle. In negotiations that determined the fate of nations, Metternich had a consistent practice of opening with a disclosure, something that appeared candid, something that seemed to cost him something to share, a limitation he acknowledged, a concern he named openly, an apparent vulnerability that made the person across from him feel that they were being dealt with honestly. The effect was immediate and reliable. The other party, disarmed by what felt like genuine openness, would reciprocate, sharing more than they had planned, softening positions they had arrived intending to hold firm, extending a trust that Metternich would then use with surgical precision to advance his actual objectives. He was not lying. The disclosures were real. The gestures were genuine, but they were also chosen, placed with deliberate care, at the exact moment and in the exact form most likely to produce the desired shift in the other person's orientation. This is the art of selective honesty, not fabrication, not performance, but the strategic deployment of real truth, the specific truth, at the specific moment in the specific form that serves the larger purpose. The generosity dimension of this law operates through the same psychological mechanism, but through a different channel. A single act of genuine generosity, especially one that arrives unexpectedly, that exceeds what the situation required, that feels personal rather than obligatory, creates an impression that accumulates interest over time. Greene points to the historical practice of powerful patrons who would, at strategic moments, extend an act of extraordinary generosity to someone whose loyalty they wanted to secure, not a series of small favors, a single, significant, unmistakable gesture, the kind that the recipient would remember and recount and carry with them as a reference point for everything that followed in the relationship, because the psychology of a single large gesture is fundamentally different from the psychology of consistent small ones. Small, consistent generosity reads as professional courtesy. A single large gesture reads as personal investment. And personal investment creates personal loyalty, the kind that holds under pressure, that persists through difficulty, that does not evaporate the moment a more attractive alternative presents itself. Now here is the dimension of this law that requires the most careful navigation, because the word victim in Greene's framing is deliberately provocative, and it is worth pausing on what he actually means by it. He does not mean victim in the sense of someone being harmed. He means it in the older, more precise sense of someone being acted upon. someone in whose direction a move is being made. And his point is not that the person being disarmed is being damaged. In many cases they are not. They are receiving something real, something valuable, something that may benefit them genuinely. His point is that the person extending the honesty or the generosity is doing so with awareness, with intention, with an understanding of what they are creating and why, and that this awareness, this strategic consciousness, operating beneath the surface of what appears to be simple warmth, is what separates the person who uses this law deliberately from the person who stumbles into its effects by accident. The difference is not in the act. It is in the understanding. There is a final thought embedded in this law that Greene does not state explicitly, but that runs beneath its entire surface. And it is this: the most durable power is never built on fear. It is not built on dominance, or coercion, or the manufactured dependency of people who stay because they have no choice. The most durable power is built on something far more fragile and far more resilient. At the same time, it is built on the genuine belief in the minds of the people around you that you are on their side, that you see them, that you have at least once given them something real. Selective honesty and strategic generosity at their highest expression are not about deceiving people. They are about understanding people, about knowing what they need to feel seen and safe and valued, and providing it with enough authenticity that the trust it generates is real, even if the timing of it was chosen. This is where the first 12 laws of power arrive, quietly at a common destination, not domination, not the cold accumulation of advantage over people who never saw it coming, but the deep, patient, sophisticated understanding of how human beings actually work, what they fear, what they need, what makes them trust and follow and believe. Power, in Greene's fullest vision, is not something you take. It is something you build, carefully, deliberately, across years of small and large decisions, in the space between what you show and what you keep, between what you say and what you do, between what you give and what you quietly, wisely hold in reserve. The first 12 laws are complete. You now hold the foundation of one of the most studied frameworks of power ever written, not as a manual for manipulation, but as a mirror reflecting the invisible dynamics that have always shaped the world, so that you can move through them with clarity, with intention, and with the quiet confidence of someone who finally understands the rules of the game they have always been playing. Part 2 begins whenever you are ready.